Welcome. Good evening, everyone. I'm particularly happy today to present Paolo Cascone for the series What's Next, which is dedicated to AA alumni to actually explain what happened after they graduated from the AA. So Paolo was born in Italy and he grew up in West India and East Africa. He graduated in architecture in Naples and he studied at the AA at the Sustainable Environmental Design program. He holds a PhD from the University of Rome. Over the past few years, actually, he has developed an interdisciplinary approach to the project of architecture, collaborating internationally with a number of firms, and building case studies between Europe and Africa in the field of environmental, parametric design, digital fabrication, and smart construction. He has been teaching in Paris at Marquet, and at the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, where he founded the COdesignLab. Paolo is been lecturing extensively internationally in various schools and institutions. And in 2014, he has participated to both the Biennale in Marrakesh and in Dakar, and with the African Fabbers project, his work has been exhibited in the Triennale in Milan. Paolo is now a scientific director of the African Fabbers School, which we'll be talking about today with us, which is the first school of urban ecology, self-construction, and digital fabrication in Africa. So please, everyone, help me welcoming Paolo Cascone.
Thanks, Marco, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here today as a former student of the Architectural Association. I will try to explain you the kind of research agenda we are developing in COdesignLab, and which is a sort of an interdisciplinary approach to architecture and urban ecologies. I was almost 15 years ago, I was investigating here at the Architectural Association issues related to sustainable design within an information-based process. And I was interested, and I'm still interested in this idea of creating strategies out of sustainable and environmental data, and also with this idea of generating a design process out of that. The very beginning of my research, applied research, was investigating of this idea of having a relationship between ecological issues and performative aspects in architecture. But unfortunately, at that time, it was very difficult to create this kind of negotiation in between sustainable topics and architecture, where actually technology was sort of very greenwashing aspects of the debate. So I start to investigate on the possibility of creating a synergy in between different understanding of ecological issues. Also creating connection between philosophy and architecture, especially with this idea of connecting different aspects of ecological process. And the ecosophy of Felix Guattari was quite important at that time, because I started to create connections between social ecology, mental ecology, and environmental ecology. So it was important to me also to understand how the whole aspects of the building construction, building design were related to a specific community, with this idea that probably an evolutionary approach to construction and design was creating the opportunities for urban laboratories like in the Middle Age. And at the same time was I'm still quite interested in this idea that open laboratories, urban laboratories of construction and self-construction are actually cultural opportunities to share different knowledges and also to create connections in between different cultures. This is, for example, is an image of a very interesting building in Mali, the Genet Mosque, which is actually an urban laboratory in a way that every year after the raining season, the building is completely restored by the population. And this is happening not just in terms of architectural and construction process, but it's also 2 weeks where people meet up and actually two different generations share knowledge in terms of use of materials, systems, and also technological issues, but it's also a social driver. So this kind of investigation is also based on this idea that probably an ecological shift has to somehow find pioneers in terms of social role of designer. And one of the pioneers was very interesting for me was Hassan Fatih, which is an Egyptian architect. Hassan Fatih dedicated his life in developing a sort of a technological evolution and his ways of producing very interesting architectural solution for low class in Egypt. With this idea of just evolve local material systems and local traditions in terms of architectural solutions. So again, the aspects related to sustainability are always related to the role of technology in design. So what is the role of technology? How the technology is directly involved in the building construction, and how we could eventually think that technology could open up to a sort of productive architecture in terms of different cultural and economic opportunities. And what is the role of a school of architecture? What is the role of school of architecture in terms of connecting different possibilities of going back to investigations between different disciplines, different material systems, with a very design research by practice approach. So basically, I was doing a sort of diachronic research and different case studies in design and architecture, where actually the sustainability in the role of school of design somehow were related to public spaces. This, for example, is a very interesting case study related to a radical group of designer architects in Italy, where in the 70s were developing a very important experiments on global tools, as a sort of an ante litteram fabrication laboratory. So they were sharing tools and techniques and technologies, creating very provocative installations in different cities, mainly in Italy, where actually the school was the most unacademic experience in Italy on this approach between material system, technology, and public space. So again, those experience belonging to the past were informing somehow my vision on how different aspects of relation between theory, computational thinking, and collaborative process where somehow could eventually be connected and interact. So I start to develop my agenda in connecting between professional practice and teaching and researching in different places in Europe, with this idea of investigating the possibility of creating a new way of defining the relationship between local issues and material system, anthropological issues related to landscape, and eventually the possibility to evolve that in a new opportunity for fabrication. So most of these experience were developed with the different kind of projects. Some of them were related to connections with the NGO between Europe and Africa. Some of them were more related to cultural events like the Marrakesh and the Dakar Biennale in Africa, and more recently the Matera 2019 Capital of Culture in Italy. So what I'm going to figure out is the kind of possibility of creating new laboratories that are working on this very specific way of contextualize actually the connection and the relationship between design and fabrication. So the very first examples and very first opportunity in my country, in Italy, was in my city, Naples, where I'm coming from. And it's coming from a very dramatic event. At that time, there actually were a big debate and international debate about the future of an entire industrial area in Italy, in Naples, where actually the biggest in Italy, where there were actually the history of the economic history of the city were actually somehow affected by this industrial activity that recently has a very, because of the economic crisis, a very difficult moment of productivities and with a very strong problem of unemployment. So there's a debate on how we could eventually transform this site. There was a couple of international competition on that. And at that time, when a part of the site was occupied by a scientific center, there was a fire, and also the demolition of the industrial site was changing the identity of this place. While this place was very interesting also because beside the industry, there was a very interesting experience where designers and engineers were inventing the personal computer, Olivetti factory. And this experience was very close to the industrial site, but they couldn't speak to each other. And this opportunity was an opportunity where actually some of the most important designers in Italy were anticipating this debate on the role of designer as producer, okay? Bruno Munari was one of that. Bruno Munari was a very smart guy, teaching Institute of Art in a very unknown city in Italy, but also giving lecture at MIT. So it was very intriguing because he was somehow investigating the possibility of creating very complex solution design process with a sort of sequences of operation, logic operation from where actually it was very clear the kind of connection between problem and solution in design. So the good designer is the one who's questioning the good problem and somehow following a sequence of possible steps that are giving families of solution. And Bruno Munari was a very smart guy also because with Olivetti Factory and Umberto Eco, which was a Nobel Prize in Literature, were somehow investigating on kinetic art, which was very important at the time in Italy. Kinetic art was opening up to designers and producers of design very interesting opportunities where personal computers and software were not available. So there was a new way of working with data, informations, and movement in design. So all this culture were coming from this industrial side. This industrial side has very poor opportunities. One of that was to rethink this as a productive research center in terms of fabrication. So when the local institutions were asking me what to do, and I was proposing them to do a very small laboratory of fabrication where students of a high school and students of the local university could develop experiments in fabricating and developing interaction design with the recycled materials. So all these materials were coming from the fire and the demolition material out after the fire. So we were the very basic background students where we were experimenting the possibilities of recycling this material, creating temporary structure for investigation in design. This one was a the very beginning of an history of working in Italy, or this, let's say, research agenda involving different scenarios and different contexts. This agenda was then opened up to other opportunities where actually we were hacking other public space. This one, for example, is in Rome, where I was asking to develop a very light structure for the House of Architecture in Rome, which is a very, very old and interesting building. But at the time, the building was unable to actually develop cultural and workshop events. So they were investigating to the possibility to have open-air laboratories. So we actually think to reuse some of the woods that was coming from the first building with a sort of a system-generating system approach, like the one mentioned in the research of Christopher Alexander. And we started to work on this grid field structure where actually the modular aspects were related to the previous structure with this idea of having a very fast deployment system that could be eventually used for different cultural event and design workshop. And also with this idea of creating a new paradigm between archaeology and light structure, which is a very delicate topic in Italy, where actually the whole historical center somehow has to be reshaped and animated with the contemporary design and contemporary cultural events. So this one was another opportunity where complexity was coming from a negotiation between different material systems, but also structural knowledge in terms of construction process. So this agenda was also informed with this idea of a sort of regionalism in terms of creating connection in between materials and how materials could eventually inform possible economic opportunities. And we start to work with in a very interesting context in the south of Italy called Vietri sul Mare. Vietri sul Mare is quite close to Amalfi and Capri, south of Italy, very close to Naples also, with a very strong tradition on ceramics and maiolica. At that time, it was very interesting because there were a bunch of artisans that they had the opportunity to meet up with Paolo Soleri. Paolo Soleri was very smart, young Italian architect at that time. He was just having his diploma from the Turin Polytechnic and going to Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States. And after 10 years was developing the Arcosanti project as one of the most interesting projects of self-construction with earth architecture. So Larry was there and was developing this, the only building, which is a sort of urban factory that he made in Italy, actually. He did a lot of architecture in the United States. This one is the only one built in Italy. And it was a very interesting urban fabrication laboratory because it's the kind of approach that he was using in designing was a very open factory where the whole process of transformation of clay was developed in using the path of the material system transformation as a driver for the design of the building, with a very interesting idea of what should be a contemporary factory, very sustainable, daylighting coming in, and a very interesting way of using passive cooling ventilation, also accelerating the process of ceramics in terms of drying, and also very interesting process of using ceramic in the facade. This is one of the most relevant case studies, ceramic integrating in the facade, also somehow improving the environmental performance of that. So this building was not just an icon, was a very contemporary way of seeing the production process as part of a city and also as a part of a landscape. A very beautiful place where a lot of designers from everywhere in the world were used to learn how to shape and work with clay in a contemporary way. So we were fascinating to this idea of creating a collaboration. So I met up with the people of the factory, understanding how we could eventually connect their 5th-generation knowledge with the more, let's say, computer-aided knowledge, and trying to understand if there is a sort of interest for them. So it was a very important test, and the test was made out of this idea of integrating digital fabrication, their factory process, especially with the possibility of working on different material system, different mix of material system, exploring how the material system could eventually react, like taking inspiration from Pompeii ceramic, where actually the volcanic material is mixed with different ceramic material, giving more structural efficiency and more lightness. So there's a very strong tradition on that. So we were working with them, learning a lot of techniques, and also informing possibilities of form finding, developing 3D printing for mold, but also 3D printing with local materials, investigating on volcanic, especially on volcanic materials. So this idea that we contextualize additive manufacturing, taking inspiration from Romans. And of course, what is interesting in during this work is also the kind of relationship with artisans and the relationship with different industrial factories. You have to know that ceramics is one of the most important in terms of economical output, the most important factory in the world of construction in Italy because of the tradition. So they were actually asking us to make studies on facade system using clay and digital fabrication. So we are now at the point to test different components, structural component, using the ceramic as also an environmental driver for passive cooling ventilation, which is always belonging to the local context. But at the same time, we were actually dealing with the municipality of Naples for a big scale project, always with this idea of hacking a space for evolving the production and the productivity of the space. And we were involved in this very controversial project related to a very well-known building called Le Vele, the Sale of Scampia. Okay, this building is has been mentioned in different places, books, and the Roberto Soviano one, which is called Gomorrah. But then out of this book, they were making movies and also fiction, very famous fiction, giving a very bad image of the neighborhood, which is a neighborhood actually populated by very diversified social scenarios. So we start to investigate the possibility of not demolish the buildings, which are very interesting megastructures made in the 60s by Franz Di Salvo, which is a very interesting guy, a designer and engineer. So we start to imagine how we could eventually imagine a sort of a self-regeneration of these buildings, where the majority of the people are still unemployed, where is an average of unemployment, probably the most important in Europe. So there's a sort of power role of a local gang and drug dealer where are actually occupying all the public space and occupying also most of the apartment that normally has to belong to very poor families. So very complicated and very controversial issue where the politics actually responded to this idea of remove totally the building, with spending a lot of money on demolishing. And they start to demolish part of the building. Actually, the Vele is composed by 4 buildings, so the first 2 were demolished. So we start to rethink the possibility to have a sort of a self-regeneration of the building with this idea of creating a bottom-up process where the building itself was somehow an infrastructure to not just rehabilitate, but also to diversify, because the kind of modularity of the building was generating also a problem in terms of mixity. So we were looking at different approach. Of course, one of the most interesting was the Unité d'Habitation of Le Corbusier in Marseille, where actually was thinking to integrate different function and different also cultural activity in the same megastructure. But we had also to develop a sort of synergy in order to involve local community, which is quite different. People very skeptical, most of them involved in crime. So it was very important also to understand what was the kind of the perception that the people was having about the project, and how they could eventually be involved in the self-construction of a diverse way of living in the structure. So we start to develop a sort of catalog of maps, understanding the constraints and also the social scenarios related to this kind of monofunctional aspects of the project. And also we discovered that the building itself, one of the buildings, especially the blue Sale, was the one that actually has more potentiality of involving the local people in the sort of rehabilitation. So we wanted to investigate how those maps were actually inform an evolutionary process of redefining private and public spaces. And we start to think that probably what was interesting in terms of also of identity was not intervene on, not reshaping the whole building, but having a sort of a surgical approach to architecture. And this surgical aspect was also belonging to this idea of creating negotiation between different needs of the local community in terms of also having different facilities, productive facilities, because most of them they were actually workers without work anymore. So we start to think that probably this infrastructure could become a sort of productive place for with facilities related to manufacturing and also urban agriculture. And we start also to develop a protocol, a scientific protocol related to this idea of using the material of demolition in the digital fabrication process. And we actually start to imagine how we could somehow interact with the structural grid, which was very, very rigid, creating opportunities for improve environmental issues related to daylighting and also thermal issues, but at the same time generating a very structural, efficient, prefabricated construction system that could be eventually something that can be considered an open system for a catalog of scenarios. This catalog of scenarios is actually dialoguing with and actually developing different performative criteria. Some of them are more structural efficiency based, some other were more related to environmental aspects. So we started to work with this idea of demolish parts of the walls and paneling systems, process the material of that, and at the same time create a sort of a catalog of possible range of possible spatial and ergonomic scenarios. One of the aspects that we are now testing is also, of course, the capability of creating a scale 1-to-1 prototype for depth. So this is going to take some time, but the idea that is now under the discussion of the public municipality of Naples is to use one of the vele, the one that we studied as a case studies of self-regeneration. So we are now in a process that is open up to a public call for designer and maker to create a proposal for reshaping and regenerating the whole neighborhood with this idea of keep the structure and work on the volumetric aspects of possible evaluation. So again, we changing scale and changing approach according to different scenarios and different environment, but always with the same interest in creating open air labs. So 1 year ago, I was involved in a very interesting project created by Joseph Grima in Matera. Matera is a very special place in the south of Italy. One of the most incredible landscape, totally carved. One of the most poorest places in Europe in the 50s, because it was actually abandoned by the local citizens because of the economic crisis after the Second World War. So there was this problem of reinventing the identity of the city. And there was a very huge debate on how we could eventually work, how design could eventually, and culture could eventually become a driver to animate again the historical center of the Matera. And they won, actually, with this idea, they won the call for the capital of culture, European capital of culture in 2019. So more or less next year. So the idea was to actually transform the historical center of Matera in an open design school. And I was selected to implement this school with a very ambitious agenda, actually. Ambitious agenda because Matera is a very small city, very important. There's a lot of tourism, there's a lot of anthropological issues related to the history of the city, but the cultural debate of the city is very, very poor, and it was very difficult also to imagine how to interact with such an important history in terms of architectural heritage. So we start to work with a group of 15 designers, artists, and artisans from everywhere in Europe with this idea of creating a sort of agenda for the school in the next couple of years. And the agenda of the school is based with this idea that the school is somehow creating all the infrastructure for the 2019 events, mainly cultural infrastructure, theater, open-air museums, and things like that. But also with this idea of using local material systems and local technology. So with this idea of creating an involvement of the community of artisans that are somehow part of the cultural debate. So what we are doing now is to understand how the school is somehow responding to different needs of the European culture. Capital of culture. So at the same time, while I was developing this kind of project, I was also interested in, for my personal history, also to create a research agenda which was responding to other issues related to Africa. I'm originally from Naples, but I grew up in Africa, and I started to be interested, when I was a student actually at the AA, in the possibility of creating a very advanced agenda on how we could evolve vernacular architecture in Africa. And this not with any kind of a humanitarian aim. So I'm saying that because there's a rhetoric behind everything is happening in Africa, which is not really responding to my point. And my point is more related to the idea that Africa is an enormous opportunity of creating a new paradigm in between sustainable design and at the same time a new process in terms of fabrication with an ecological understanding. And it's a very, very, I'm saying that because in Italy there is a huge debate now. You know, you have to understand that hundreds of thousands of people are coming over in Italy on the southern coast from different places in Africa, and there's a huge debate in politics where no one is really interested in the identity of these people. They really think that they are just people, uneducated people, okay? Which is not actually. And these countries are not these countries are growing very fast, so they are very dynamic. And of course, they have a lot of problems. But the problem, the main problem is related to this capability of building their own economy. And in terms of responding to the needs of housing, for example, there's a lot of paradox right now in different places in Africa, like in Niger, where Chinese constructors are developing new towns from zero, importing everything from everything, so without creating local opportunities of growth in terms of construction and industrial production. So I say to myself that probably there was an opportunity to somehow invest on a project that was responding to the need of a new class of designers and architects in Africa. I was not that surprised actually that if you compare the number of inhabitants in Africa related to the number of designers, is 1/5 less than in Italy, for example. And this also was very interesting because I start to also map Fab Labs, okay, in Africa. And I discovered that Fab Labs are more, the network of Fab Labs are growing more faster than universities and schools of architecture. So I say to myself that probably was time where we should think about a new an academic research, applied research and education program for this region, inspired by local and vernacular culture that is effectively more contemporary than we considered before. Very interesting possibility to create connection between geometry, material system, and diversified solutions. So with this idea of, which is very contemporary actually, use geometry as a driver for creating interaction between climatic issues, but also with this idea of optimization, redundancy as a responsive aspects to optimization and adaptability to specific climate. But I wasn't that naive to think that contemporary architecture has to be similar to vernacular architecture in Africa. So I was looking to very interesting case studies where, like the one in Jean Prouvé tropical house, where prefabrication issues were related to tropical climate. So this project was actually tested in different places between Ivory Coast and Cameroon, a different scale 1-to-1 prototype financed by French industries in the 60s, and of housing unit, but also school unit. Again, this was a very experimental project. It was a failure, actually, but was also interesting because of that. It was a failure because actually there was no connection with the local material system. So everything was imported. But also very interesting with this ambition to develop a sort of a contemporary way to work with climatic issues related to African context. At the same time, I was collaborating with a group of very strange people in the United States at the Rensselaer Polytechnic, ethnomathematicians between computer science and cultural anthropology. Ron English is one of them. The very interesting book called African Fractals. This book was very inspiring for me because it was the very first time where I see the possibility of reconstructing the logic of unplanned settlements and also spontaneous architecture in Africa as a very, very logic way to create connection in between organization of society, local materials, and climatic issues. So the results of all of that is a very complex way of using local technology, and this is also very interesting because Ron English's work was creating a sort of cause-effect relation, abacus, of different climatic regions according to different material systems, from earth architecture to wooden architecture, where again spontaneous pattern where a sort of a negotiation between different aspects of the local society, very contemporary in a way that was producing a non-standard solution, very diversified possibilities. So when I started to be interested in that, I was also looking for case studies, pioneers that were somehow could eventually become a driver for my personal agenda. And I started to collaborate with a very interesting guy called Fabrizio Carola. This guy now is 85 years old. I was spending, it was originally from Naples, actually. I didn't know that. And he studied at La Cambre in Brussels, very interesting school in terms of relation between architecture and structural engineering. And Fabrizio was working with Hassan Fatih, actually, the Egyptian architect I was mentioning before. And he started to work for almost 40 years in between Morocco, Mauritania, Mali, and other sub-Saharan countries, with a very personal way of reinterpreting local technology. And I think this is very rich from him, was actually developing very concrete project, schools, hospitals, generating families of solutions using always local bricks as component for woodless constructions, walls and domes, and also creating hybrid solutions out of that. But what is interesting in Fabrizio actually work is not just architecture and the relation with the local climate and landscape, but also the technological issues related to this object here, which is actually a sort of analogic compass, okay? It was evolving this from Hassan Fatih researchers. And this compass is an antiliteram robotic arm, I would say, because it's a device which is organizing the position of the bricks in the space, creating opportunities of generating very diversified structures according to different possibilities. So for me, it was an honor to work with him because I was learning an hands-on approach where actually geometry, structure, and technology were strongly related to a specific context. So I started to collaborate with him with this idea of working on a sort of evolutionary process in terms of learning from local unplanned settlements, but also creating possibilities to evolve that in terms of environmental issues, creating possibilities of having cupolas inside cupolas, creating impluvium, so storing water and daylight, creating these opportunities to diversify also the skin. And we built, actually, before the war in the north of Mali, we built the first prototype. And then the work was unfortunately interrupted. Also because Fabrizio was becoming old, actually, so he moved to Italy. But we continue to work on that with this idea to evolve this work. So not just absorb something, but also evolve. So I was starting to take part to some smart geometry workshop in around the world. And I proposed to the people from ETH in Zurich to eventually work on the cupola system that we were doing with Fabrizio and Mali, using at that time not the compass but the robotic arm. And this was the first cupola actually developed out of this process. And actually the project was developed at the IAC in Barcelona. So after this experience, I started to develop other experience with my students in the region, always taking inspiration by Fabrizio Carola architecture. Working with the students coming mainly from different areas in Africa. You have to think that schools of architecture in France, where I was teaching, the average of people were coming from sub-Saharan region. Of the students were from sub-Saharan countries. And it was very interesting to work with them with this agenda because they were quite skeptical at that time. And I know why, because they were asking me to work on a very contemporary design process, and they didn't imagine that they were actually going back to their origin and somehow reinterpreting that. It was very, very complicated to convince someone that is coming from a very strong identity. Also me, when I was a student here at the with a very strong background, architectural background, I got really confused and also scared about this idea of losing. And also I was refusing this idea of having an identity in my way of working on the built environment. So it's very difficult to work with the young African students of architecture and convince them that it's interesting to work with their own cultural identity. And we developed many projects, playgrounds with woodless construction. We work also with projects that were regenerating abandoned place. This one, for example, is a project that we did in Morocco for the Marrakesh Biennale in 2014. This project has two objectives. Okay, one was regenerating an old factory in the Medina of Marrakesh. Okay, and the other one regenerating the factory as a temporary school of digital fabrication with local materials. So we start to work with different material system, textile, always speculating with the local technologies, starting to understand how local technology could eventually be reinterpreted for develop temporary installation of public space. But at the same time, we were also fascinating to this idea of developing tools, okay? So not architectural or design solutions, but tools. So we were developing part of the temporary school for develop the first prototype of energy self-sufficient 3D printing, realized with local artisan in Marrakesh. So the idea was not just teaching them, give them the fish, but also teaching them how to fish. It's a completely different way to approach. And this is also with this idea of creating a self-sufficiency in a way that these regions could speculate on technologies. Of course, what was interesting for us was not just giving them the possibility to learn how to self-construct the tools, but also how to use the tools with local materials. So we did very interesting experiment on developing, processing local materials from the desert in the digital fabrication for components related to architectural construction project. Another interesting way of working with this idea of urban fabrication laboratories was coming out from the experience of the Dakar Biennale in Senegal, where actually we were working on a craftsman neighborhood called SICAP, very colonial neighborhood, not really responding to the way that the people normally use public space as an open-air laboratory for manufacturing. So we were actually work with them with this idea of developing the first Fab Lab in Senegal. Okay, but the Fab Lab was integrated in a series of laboratories of manufacturing of the city. So we were working with this idea of having a sort of a space in common where actually people involved in wooden manufacturing and other pottery manufacturing were actually using the laboratory, sharing machinery and also some of the aspects of the digital fabrication agenda of the laboratory. The same time, I was also involved in a very interesting research with UN Habitat. So this African Fabbers project was dealing with institutions involved in self-construction in emergency situations. So we were actually developing a very interesting project that was presented at the World Urban Forum. It was a fast deployment and off-grid structure for emergency using very simple modular system that could eventually create catalog of possible scenarios, but with also this idea of lightness and modularity using textile photovoltaics for generating energy out of that. So this is one of the aspects we are now developing so far, because actually we are now entering in a new phase of the activity in Africa, because we actually won a competition to develop a school in Cameroon. And the school is called African Fabbers School, and actually it's the interaction between these different disciplines I was mentioning before. The school is financed by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and actually we are now working in different directions, because we would like to create a network of schools around Europe, collaborating with the school in Cameroon, with this idea of sharing knowledge, where students, African students, could eventually develop some specific research in Europe, while European students could eventually develop some interesting research in Africa. So somehow creating a shift in the way that we could eventually imagine a new platform where a dialogue between different educational institutions could eventually. But we are also working with this idea that the school could become an economic opportunity for the students. So we are now creating a network of design factory, especially in Italy, that are somehow interested in supporting some of the research and prototype of the students. And we discovered that there's a lot of Italian design factory that invest in Africa, especially in the field of wooden system. And so we are creating a very diversified network of partners and institutions. And we are now entering in a new phase. And the phase is the self-construction of the school itself. So it's, we just came from the first mission in Douala, where the school is going to be based, which is the second city of Cameroon, where actually we visit the site. And the site is belonging to our partner, which is a local NGO, an Italian NGO, working in Cameroon since almost 50 years. And it's a very huge site with also an abandoned building that we probably use for part of the activities. But we want also to develop the whole construction with the local community of artisans and students from schools around the neighborhood, because we would like the school to become an open fabrication laboratory and also a public space where actually different knowledge could eventually be shared. So we, in the next couple of months, we're going to launch 2 open call for also European designer and architects to be part of the self-construction project. Thank you. Each particular project is a very specific and personal history, I would say. It's really the kind of process I was telling you today was also belonging of a story of the story of my family as well, because I started to work with Fabrizio Carola because I knew from my father, which is a doctor, that Fabrizio Carola was the one who was making a beautiful hospital in Mauritania. So I was sometime, it was coming in my mind that there were places and people that were creating very special researches with a very low budget. So I think this is one of the aspects which is really intriguing me, the using very low budget agenda as a constraint for a very complex way of working with the design process. Because I say to myself that if I could do this with a very low budget, I could eventually do better with the. So it was also a test for me. But again, it's a process related to relations with people, because some of the projects I mentioned were also coming just because we start to work with a group of students from Burkina Faso, and they were proposing to make experiments with local tectonic systems and speculating on that. So we somehow generate a sort of an opportunistic way of working in a very extreme condition. The cupola one I was mentioning with Fabrizio Carola, I was quite skeptical about his architecture at the very beginning. I was thinking that somehow there was a sort of an aesthetic way of formalistic way to work with this kind of let's say architectural symbol of local architecture, local aesthetic. And then I discovered during the construction that Fabrizio was working on the production more than on the shape of the buildings. He was very concerned about the idea that all the material were coming from a kilometer zero process, and also the firing of the bricks were actually generated not with cutting wood, but just recycling the rice plant. So this opened me a new way to have a look to this kind of, let's say, tectonic. Because I was saying to myself, I was, when I was speaking with my father, he was always complaining on Fabrizio Hospital. It was very beautiful, but it was very difficult to place. The hospitals are hospitals. You really have to have straight spaces, physical constraints related to a specific device and everything. So, but it was very interesting also how it was creating this negotiation. So I say to myself that it was a poetry which was also very concrete, because the production very concrete and very sustainable in order to be replicated, because of the production cycle, because of the possibilities of creating space in space that could eventually generate thermal comfort, which is one of the most important aspects in this kind of a very extreme. And also, what I didn't show today, but what was interesting also in this work, that he was also starting to understand that local society was interested in multi-story buildings. So he was creating the possibility to build cupola on the top on another cupola, which is a very interesting way of distributing also loads. So again, I think that when you see behind this kind of very special designer, you suddenly discover that there's a lot of potential to replicate and, of course, to actualize this. But you really have to go in deep in the whole process of connecting the material, the kind of process, and the possibilities of generating pools of also very contemporary solution for architecture. So again, it's a very experimental approach, and you have to take, I think, in each of these projects, you have to take probably one aspect to integrate in a more advanced agendas. Of course, as I was saying before, African cities are going very fast, so you really have to respond also to this timing that is somehow accelerating urbanization process. So the negotiation between very sustainable process and timing is one of the issues that probably has to be investigated in the next step of this research agenda. There are many factors that are related to the issue of scale and the issue also of the characteristic of local materials according to the potentiality of that. So it's interesting how you could each time in different places play with these different variables and give a sort of hierarchy where creating a sort of a multiscalar approach to, and this is one of the aspects. So somehow use the local constraints as driver, okay? As driver for scale component, as driver for environmental strategy, as driver for ergonomic aspects, but also as driver for possible opportunities for replicate this kind of, because this is one of the aspects that we are interested to develop and forward in the, for example, in the African Fabbers School in Cameroon, is the possibility to develop open systems that could eventually be replicated in a way that could be adaptable, okay? So there are many keywords related to scale, adaptability, but the possibility of creating a narrative out of the dialogue with the local context as a driver, for me is the main aspect that also helps me to somehow reconsider an ecological understanding of architecture. So the idea is every time to develop site-specific strategy and create negotiation out of that. So you see sometimes bricks are different scale because actually we adapt to different consistency of clay, and this is changing also, or we are adapting according to different quality of wood, so we can work on modular sticks that are changing according to the kind of wood that we have, and this is affecting the decision on the structural morphology and the structural organization. So this is part of a poetic that we want to develop forward. And of course, it's I didn't show you a commercial project because there aren't actually. There are all the projects that we are doing in this kind of work are investigations. Some of the colleagues were thinking that introducing 3D printing in Africa was something very cool and fashionable somehow. The reason why I decided to work on that topic is because actually those countries, they didn't have the industrial revolution that we had before. So it was much more easy for them to work with this idea of creating a digital connection between an idea and the physical output, rather than proposing things that were coming from our industrial. I will do you an example. If you see the map of mobile telephone in Africa, it's like 10 times more dense than a map of mobile phones in Europe. And the mobile phones are driver for many digital applications. It's not just for making phone calls. So that means that there's a very informal way of working with digital tools in Africa that somehow changing our vision of these countries as countries of countries where digital culture doesn't exist. So again, digital fabrication was a natural way of connecting this possibility of use those tools also for creating manufacturing. There's another question. So there's easier than we can also teach a Moroccan clay artisan how to self-construct a 3D printer. Is easier than teach an Italian because they have a very specific knowledge on mechanic, very specific knowledge on geometrical issues. They are, as I was saying before, talking about African fractals. They are very, very, they're very strong mathematic culture. And this was one of the reasons why I decided to put this in an agenda, not because I think that digital fabrication will solve the problem of humanities, of course, will never happen, but because was the most closest example of a sort of a pseudo-industrial process that we could eventually integrate. The third reason why I think this is interesting is also because there are contextual algorithms in the African culture that are belonging to a specific way of using geometry for many aspects of their life. And in integrating these contextual algorithms with local mix of materials, I found this very interesting, and 3D printing and digital manufacturing are somehow very helpful for that, creating connection between, so replicating, but also evolve this kind of implicit algorithmic way of creating artifacts in African culture. So I found this very natural. Of course, there's a lot of things to do for integrating this in schools and in School of Architecture, but it's very, very natural.